Welcome to Coffee Cups and Flying Saucers. Thank you for coming to our meeting today. I am Maria Tellier, the New Mexico Director of the Mutual UFO Network, and I present here at Otero Arts on the third Saturday of every month at 11 a.m. I try to pick a topic that we can all relate to, preferably New Mexico related. There's snacks and coffees in the back. If anyone's interested, please help yourself. I've got to say, the most requested and talked about topics are abduction related. So today I'm going to discuss the 1975 abduction of Staff Sergeant Charles Moody. I have some pictures from Thunder Road to share that were taken shortly after the abduction. Never been shown publicly before. Staff Sergeant Moody was stationed at Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, and he was a cargo mechanic. Moody was abducted in the early morning hours of August 13th, 1975 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, just off Thunder Road. His abduction was investigated by Jim Lorenzen and Wendell Stevens of APRO, and I had access to the original APRO case file. The investigation started August 21st, just 8 days after the event. However, APRO did not publish the article in the Bulletin until June of 1976. This was to protect his privacy. I am bringing this event to our attention in August while we're in the midst of the Perseid meteor shower window. If we look at our northeast here, over in the La Luz, Lorbacina Canyon area, above the Sacramentos, the meteors are visible nightly, July 17th through August 24th, from 10 p.m. until dawn. So I'm going to review the original case, and then I'm going to show photos taken by Moody's wife. She took those shortly after August 22nd, 1975. I drove out to the site and I took photos from her same vantage points. That way we can compare how the area looked then to how it looks now. Her pictures were taken less than 10 days after the abduction. So that event was very clear in Moody's mind. He was very clear about those locations. So I visited the National UFO Historical Record Center in Rio Rancho in March of this year. I was given copies of all the investigative materials from the original APRO case file. It contained Jim and Carl Lorenzen's notes. It had copies of phone conversations. They recorded phone conversations and then they transcribed them. I have copies of Moody's medical bills. There was no HEPA back then. Carl Lorenzen called up and was given his medical information over the phone. And I have these original Polaroid photos from the abduction site. The photos were taken by Karen Moody at Jim Lorenzen's request. This location is next to the Upper Heights Tanks off Thunder Road. That's just below the Big A on Ortega Peak. The Moody's lived on Ridgecrest Drive. That's off Scenic. It's just 2 blocks northeast of 10th Street. Charles and his wife Karen wrote many personal letters to Jim and Carl Lorenzen over the years, and they shared their Alamogordo address and his next two duty stations with them. First, I'm going to do a review of the event, and then we're going to dig into those photos a little closer. So this whole abduction, it started on the night of Tuesday, August 12th, 1975. Earth encounters Perseid meteors as they pass closest to the orbit of comet Swift-Tuttle. Yearly, the Perseid meteors are visible from July 17th to August 24th, but they are crazy active August 12th and 13th, with 50 to 100 meteors per hour from 10 p.m. to dawn. This year it was a little too cloudy to watch them. On August 12th, 1975, The moon was in its waxing crescent phase and just 43% illuminated. It had risen in the east around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it set around 1:39 a.m. on August 13th in the west. That's towards Las Cruces. The moon was not visible in the area during the meteor showers, and it was not a factor in any way that night. This is this view is from skyearth.com. It gives a view of the sky at what's called the radiant. This is where the meteors originate from. The radiant for the Perseids is to the northeast. So Moody was looking to the area again above the Sacramentos around La Luz. That night, Moody was very close to the mountain's edge, and he was like looking straight up. He had his neck craned. He was looking straight up. Sergeant Moody worked what's called at Holloman. He worked what's called swings. That's from 2:30 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. And while driving home on Route 70, as he's driving east, he frequently saw meteors above the Sacramentos. On the night of August 12th, Moody came home from work, ate dinner, watched Johnny Carson until about 12:30, and then he read the Alamogordo Daily News. The paper said that the Perseid meteor showers were going to be very active that night, so he wasn't tired, so he decided to drive out to a dirt road near his home. It had no street lights, and he figured he could watch them for a few hours before going to bed. So Moody jumped into his car. He drives out the Thunder Road in Alamogordo to watch the meteor showers. So this was between 12:30 p.m. 12:30 a.m. and 12:45 a.m. Moody sat on the front fender of his car, and he started to watch the sky to the northeast. He saw several meteors, but they were very sporadic. But around 1:30 a.m., Moody saw a large meteor coming over the area of the Sacramento Mountains around La Luz. It was to the northeast. It was headed right at him. And as it got larger and larger, it was so close that he was able to see it wasn't a meteor. It was a gray craft headed right at him. It stopped dead and just hung in the air 15 to 20 feet off the ground right in front of him. He looked at it, estimating the craft to be 50 feet across. He noticed several globes of glass on the bottom and a large window in the front, where he could see two or three humanoid figures looking at him. When he saw the humanoids looking back at him, he was startled, and he jumped off his fender and he ran to the front seat trying to start his car, but it would not start. He sat there and he started to panic. He was looking at this object hovering through his windshield, and then he began to hear a drilling noise. He said it was like a dentist drill. And then the car enveloped in a fog, and his body went numb. He said, though, he became very calm, and then he lost consciousness. Next thing he remembers is looking up in the front seat of the car and watching this same craft lifting straight up and leaving the area. He looked at his watch and it was 2:45 a.m. He had lost 90 minutes of time. He was groggy, and he could not remember what had happened after the fog enveloped inside the car. But his car was now able to start, and he drove home to his wife, who was waiting for him. She was very worried because it was so late. He told her everything he remembered, but he could remember seeing the object approach the car, his running to the front seat and being unable to start the car. But his next memories were of the object leaving and then checking his watch. She believed him, but was very concerned about his condition and his state of mind. This image of Charles Moody is easily found if you Google him. I used it last year, since it was the only image I had of him at that time. But this is not Charles Moody from Holloman Air Force Base. This Moody is a Marine. I noticed the insignia on his cap and his collar, and they're not Air Force insignias. They're Marine Corps emblems. Moody was extremely confused about what had happened to him. He knew he couldn't talk to his leadership about it, so he went to the local newsstand and bought a National Enquirer newspaper, and he sent a letter to the editor about what had happened that night. Moody's son had a copy of UFO magazine in his room, so he also wrote them a letter about his encounter. He asked them both where could he go for help to remember what had happened to him in the early morning hours of August 13th, 1975? What had happened during those 90 minutes of lost time? Bernard O'Connor, the editor of UFO magazine, called Jim Lorenzen of APRO, read the Moody letter to Jim, and eventually he did forward the original copy to Jim. Lorenzen immediately called Staff Sergeant Moody at his home in Alamogordo on August 20th, but Moody was at work. So he spoke with his wife. His wife was aware of the letters and was hoping one of the magazines would call. Jim Lorenzen questioned her about that night, and she confirmed everything Moody had in his letter. She also told Lorenzen that she was a nurse and she was concerned about Chuck's health and his state of mind. He was in pain, he was gray, he was ashen, and he was in a panic mode when he came home that night. She asked Lorenzen to call back the next day around noon. He did. That was on the 21st of August, and he spoke with Moody. That was just 8 days after the event. I looked up the addresses to the National Enquirer and to UFO Magazine. The Enquirer is located in Lantana, Florida, and UFO Magazine is on Park Avenue in New York. So they mailed those letters out snail mail, and they had them within 8 days of when they mailed them. Moody explained to Jim Lorenzen that he had went out to watch the meteor shower. He saw one coming at him and he realized it was a gray craft. He said he saw something looking back at him from a window on the craft, so he ran to his car. It wouldn't start, and then it filled with smoke and he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he looked at his watch. He watched the craft rise up and leave, and it was 90 minutes of time had passed. But after the object had left, his car started and he drove home to his wife, and he said his wife was frantic, but he told her everything he had seen. He also explained to Lorenzen that since that night he had become ill. Jim Lorenzen advised him to go to sick call, but don't tell them what happened that night. If he did, they would send him to the psych ward, so don't tell them what happened that night. So, start Sergeant Moody had developed a rash on the lower parts of his body. It looked like heat rash. He also said he felt like someone had hit him with a baseball bat in the lower part of his back, and he was sore all over. He followed Lorenzen's advice, and he did not tell the base doctor about the incident in the desert the night of the 13th. But after Moody's initial examination, he was evacuated to William Beaumont Hospital in El Paso. This was on August 25th. HIPAA really wasn't a big thing, I guess, back in 1975, so there was no problem when Carl Lorenzen of APRA called, and they gave her all the information about Moody's visit to Beaumont. On the page with Carl Lorenzen's notes, she had written in big letters, "Hush, hush." He was hospitalized for 3 or 4 days on a ward for radiation protocol, and several discs were out of place in his back. He had burns and blisters, and there was a note he was given a 2-hour enema and cathartic pills. Cathartic pills induce, let's call them movements, and they're given to accelerate removal of radioactive contaminants in the digestive tract. When someone swallows or inhales radioactive material like silesium or thallium, doctors administer specific cathartics to clear their gut out rapidly. That reduces the duration the body is exposed to radiation. However, by that day in the hospital, Moody had been exposed to radiation internally for 13 days. There's also a note on that same page that says puncture marks and extreme anxiety. This is the real picture of Staff Sergeant Charles Moody. He's sitting at the table at the Moody home with Jim Lorenzen. Moody worked at Holloman Air Force Base as a cargo aircraft mechanic. He had over 700 hours of flight time. He worked swing shifts starting at 2:30 p.m., getting done at 11:30 p.m. He was 32 years old and had been in the Air Force for 13 years. He lived with his wife Karen and 2 kids in Alamogordo. They owned their home on Ridgecrest Drive. This photo was taken with Lorenzen on September 2nd, 1975. Also there was Wendell Stevens, an APRO investigator, who had flown himself and Jim Lorenzen to Alamogordo. This was just 20 days after the Moody abduction. There had been many phone calls between everyone at APRO and Moody. They had all become very good friends and they were respectful of each other. Moody had developed a trust, and he was very hopeful that APRO could help him to remember what had happened to him that night. September 2nd, Jim Lorenzen and Wendell flew to Alamogordo in Stevens's aircraft, and they interviewed their new buddy Chuck Moody. Wendell Stevens was the pilot, and he flew them from Tucson, Arizona to Alamogordo White Sands Regional. Stevens was also a former lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He was a longtime APRO investigator and a noted author. Stevens and Jim Lorenzen wrote several books together throughout the years. Moody was comfortable with them both, maybe because Jim and Wendell were both former Air Force. Jim had also been in the Air Force. He was in security forces. He had also worked at Holloman. He was a contractor while he and Coral lived in Alamogordo. That was from 1954 to 1960. They both worked on base, and they still had very close ties to the Alamogordo community. And I think that's maybe why Jim and Coral took such a special interest in this Moody case. Moody and his daughter picked up Jim and Wendell at White Sands Regional. They drove over and picked them up, and then they all went to the abduction site. They drove up to the park where Moody had parked that night to watch the Perseids. Jim and Wendell were really interested in investigating that location to look for trace evidence. Although they didn't find any evidence of a landing, they did notice Moody's behavior. He became quite agitated while at the abduction site. He told them he had feelings of apprehension and fear and he wanted to run away. Several times during the interview there, Chuck pointed out he had commando training and he was not afraid of any man, and that he was very defensive with them. Now, it was very evident to both Jim and Wendell that something very traumatic had happened to Sergeant Moody at that location. When they all went back to the home on Ridgecrest Drive, Moody was his old self, and they enjoyed each other's company and had a pleasant afternoon together. The feelings he had were not nearly so pronounced back at the house or even when he had spoke with them on the phone. During the visit, Moody was still unable to remember anything that had happened during those 90 minutes of missing time. Jim and Wendell both told him to relax, and they assured him that in time his memories of that night would return. He just needed to be patient, and most importantly, not to discuss what had happened with anyone on base. In the APRO notes, it is noted they discussed Moody having a visit with Dr. James Harder for some hypnotic regression therapy, and that Moody was very open to doing that. But I was unable to find any evidence that Dr. Harder had actually met with Moody. I read the entire file, and there were no notes in there from Dr. Harder. Now, Moody learned some relaxing techniques, and when he did this, his memories started to return, just like Jim and Wendell told him they would. And in September of 1975, they started coming back to him in little pieces and batches. Um, by October, he was able to sit down and write a letter to the Lorenzens about what had happened because his complete memories on board the craft had returned to him. He started out with what I saw that night on board their craft were things I cannot explain, but I can only try. It was a 3-page letter that he wrote to them. He said he had always remembered seeing the outside of the craft. He saw it approach and he saw it leave, but now he remembers waking up on board, lying on a metal table, and that the air smelled like burnt sugar. It was thick and difficult to breathe. He could also hear a high-pitched whine, like a dentist drill, and it made him very anxious. He recalls lying on the table, unable to move, and he could see indirect light above him and that it was a white domed roof. He felt the interior was much too large compared to the exterior that he had viewed that night, and he thought maybe they had taken him somewhere. Moody stated that there were 3 beings watching him, one who he called the Elder and 2 others. They were about 5 foot tall, and he said they looked very much like us, except their heads were larger and they had no hair. The skin on their heads was wrinkly and their ears were very small. They had little eyes, and I'm sorry, they had eyes that were larger than ours. Their nose was smaller, and they had very thin lips. He said their weight was between 110 and 130, and they wore clothing that was skin tight with no zippers or buttons. The elder, felt who he felt was the leader because he wore a silver white suit when the other 2 wore all black. This elder called Moody's son and gave him a tour of the craft. Moody was a mechanic, so he was very interested in that engine room. He said before he could ask a question, it was like the elder had read his mind and stated the answer. So this is a drawing that Moody made that day when Jim and Wendell visited the Moody home. I copied his notes to the side so you could read them yourself. His handwriting is good, but it's still a little clearer. They spoke about that night while they visited him in Alamogordo. Moody told Lorenzen, "This thing just seemed to come down so fast. It was almost like it just appeared, you know. But you could actually see that it had actually descended. It just became perfectly still, no noise, no nothing, and advanced towards where I was very, very slowly. I would estimate maybe at walking speed." So now I'm going to go to the part where we're going to review those original photos from the APRO case file more closely. When Jim Lorenzen called Moody on the August 21st, he also asked him to go to the exact location and park his car in the exact spot where he was when he saw that object, and then have someone take pictures from every direction. And he did. And these pictures were taken by his wife Karen using a Polaroid SX70. That's the instant photo, the one that spits the film out as soon as you take the picture. It self-develops right on the spot. It gets darker while you look at it. The images are now faded over all these years, but the Alamogordo landscape line of the Sacramento Mountains is still very visible. They took the photo somewhere between August 21st and September 1st before the Lorenzens visited them. So I'm going to review these. Of course, I made some maps and I took photos up on Thunder Road and we can match them all up together. This image is a street map of Alamogordo from 1985. I used the historical image because I wanted you to see how close Ridgecrest Drive, where they lived, was to the location that he drove to that night on Thunder Road next to the Upper Heights tank area to watch that meteor shower. Many of the houses that are there now weren't built yet. I had checked the Alamogordo tax records online so I could eliminate some of the houses that showed up in some of the photos that I took, during this investigation. The Space Museum was under construction, so it was not visible in any of his original photos, even though the ridge that the object flew in from was directly above the Space Museum. So they lived on Ridgecrest Drive, and you can see that I have a little blue box at the bottom of the map. And he drove over. I put those little red dots over to Thunder Road. I looked for the most direct route. I made those dots so that you can see the path and you can see the yellow box, which is the Upper Heights tanks. That's where he drove to that night. Moody's testimony to Jim Lorenzen was recorded on a reel-to-reel tape. The National Historical Records Center transposed that tape to text of the interview. Moody said in the interview, "So I got in my car and we drove out just a little bit on the outskirts of Alamogordo, New Mexico, and went down a dirt road. Oh, I guess maybe I'd estimate maybe 3/4 of a mile to a mile. It was a dirt road and it turned off to the left onto an adjoining dirt road. And I got out of my automobile and I sat on the left front fender. In my photos, you can see Thunder Road is still very remote location. In 1975, the road was still dirt and it's not nearly as wide as it is now. Driving east on Thunder Road to the Upper Heights tank area, the road is only paved out part way. It stops where the Lincoln National Forest property line begins. The Big A Mountain is on Ortega Peak in the Sacramento Mountains. The tank fence is in the Big A photo. This is about 3/4 of a mile off the scenic turnoff. Moody said he sat on the fender of his car and smoked a cigarette, watching the meteor showers. He had left his house August 13th around 12:30, quarter to 1, when Johnny Carson was done. So his ordeal with this craft, it began around 1:30, and he regained consciousness at 2:45. He looked at his watch and realized he had 90 minutes of missing time. Now, I put a red arrow just to match up those mountain peaks. In my picture, there's a sign on the yellow fence that says National Forest Boundary Marker. If you go up there right now, there's a lot of construction going on in this area. The ditch that Moody pulled off to is now being cut in as a road. It runs parallel with Thunder Road from the Upper Heights tank down along the arroyo that's there. The National Forest boundary lines are along the Alamogordo city limits. That's the black line that you see about in the middle of this map. Moody was parked in a pull-off area from the Upper Heights tank. I put a green arrow on the Upper Heights tank and a red arrow where Moody was parked. I think this map gives you an idea of just exactly where he was that night, how close he was to the city limits and to the national park boundary. Moody had returned to the site shortly after the event, even before he was contacted by APRO. He was out there like a day or so after it had happened. He saw an 80-foot area of swirled grass. So he didn't take any photos then, but he went back to check the area after he saw that swirled grass. He went back with a radiation monitor with a Geiger counter. He brought one home from base. He was already really concerned that he might have had some kind of exposure to radiation. He was starting to get the rash, and eventually he was diagnosed with radiation poisoning from William Beaumont Hospital in El Paso on August 25th. So Jim Lorenzen had asked Moody to return to the site and to take some pictures. He and his wife did some walking back to the spot where he saw the swirled grass. I believe it was down in the Arroyo on the National Forest property. Their picture is the one on the left. And I really wasn't certain of the direction because he didn't write it on this photo like he did the other ones. So I used that damn AI to compare my photo to his because I was trying to identify that ridge that I have a red arrow pointing to. And AI said that my ridge look slightly different. The angle was slightly different, but it was the same low ridge running from the west northwest to north northwest. It was consistent with the photo I took in June when I walked down into the arroyo and I took the photo on the right. So according to AI, the photos are very similar. Just the angle's a little different, and that's the same ridge that I have that in my photo is the one that's showing in Moody's photo. That ditch that Moody pulled off to is now being cut in as a road, or maybe it's a runoff. I'm really not sure. It runs parallel with Thunder Road from Upper Heights down into the Arroyo. There's another tank down there. It's just on the other side of the tank. You can see that ditch really good in the image, and there's a red property line like right on top of it. If you go there now, again, there's a lot of construction. The city limit line is where the paved road ends. And that single tank, it's marked as 3221 on this map. And I put a yellow arrow to it just in case um, you were looking for it. That big concrete arroyo was not there. The arroyo was dirt at that time. It was just the natural runoff from the mountain. It was it was concreted over sometime in the 80s, and this new road I think is running straight to it. Okay, so this top view that you see is looking south from the Space Museum parking lot. I put a red arrow on the big A, and you can see the Heights tanks just below it. The bottom photo I took from Scenics down around First Avenue. And I was looking north at the big A. I put a red arrow again on the big A. In 1975, this was a very, very remote area. It had very few homes out there. And the Lincoln National Forest is still undeveloped in that area where Moody feels that the craft landed. With that construction going on in that area now, it could be a possibility that they're going to build homes in there. My best identification is that the craft flew over Horse Ridge. And that would be in the Indian Wells Canyon area. That's Big Large Arroyo is still in the space between the Space Museum and Thunder Road. This image I took from the area Moody feels the object landed, and it looks directly at the Space Museum. I parked my car in Moody's spot and I walked down into the arroyo trying to get the same angle in my photos that Moody's wife had in hers. Construction of the New Mexico Museum of Space History. It was originally called the International Space Hall of Fame. The Space History Museum's in Alamogordo, and it had began in 1973, but it wasn't completed until 1976. The dedication ceremony was in October of 1976. Big Titan missile, Big Joe, that was not placed at that location until 1985. The planetarium and the IMAX dome, they weren't even constructed until 1981. So none of those were visible to Moody in 1975. There was building construction at the museum, but it was not completed. Photos I'm showing you have the Upper Heights water tank in them. This is how I was able to find the exact location off Thunder Road where Moody was parked. Moody's original photos on the left and the other two are mine of the eastern view. I did verify that the Upper Heights tanks were there in 1975. You can't see the second tank in any of the photos, but it's parallel with that one in the front. My red arrows are pointing to the same peak that's visible in all of those photos. His testimony, Moody's testimony was, I went down a dirt road 3/4 of a mile and I turned off to an adjoining dirt road to the left. I parked my automobile and I sat on the left front fender. In my photos, those houses are at the base of the Big A and that cell tower were not there in 1975. The only thing that was the tank and that little telephone pole. It was a lot smaller back then, but there was a telephone pole there. This is what if you're looking to the west, you would be looking toward the base. The car is facing at you. His car is facing at you, and so is mine. The location of that telephone pole was very helpful in placing Moody's car. That telephone pole was there. Look at the difference in the width of the dirt road. Um, I put my car in the exact locations where Moody's was and look at the width difference between then and now. So Thunder Road back then, I mean it's a narrow road now, but back then it was even more narrow. National Enquirer had headlines on May 11th, 1976. U.S. Air Force Sergeant details his incredible experience on board a flying saucer. Scientific truth detector confirms he was kidnapped by humanoids in a spacecraft. Page 4. The APRO Bulletin article regarding Staff Sergeant Moody was published after this Rags article in June of 1976. And then they did a follow up with Jim Lorenzen regarding the completion of his investigation in the July 1976 bulletin. Lorenzen ends the July article with, when mentioned to a National Enquirer reporter, it triggered their interest to the point where they eventually arranged to fly me overseas to introduce one of their reporters to Moody. Up to that point, he had asked us to keep his identity secret, and we obliged. So maybe this is why the Lorenzens waited 9 months to publish this report, and then published it after the National Enquirers. But in August of 1975, right after the event, Moody had sent a letter about needing help. If you remember, he sent it to both the UFO magazine and the National Enquirer. Moody had contacted the National Enquirer before APRO ever got the lead about this event. When Jim and Wendell Stevens visited the Moody's in Alamogordo on September 2nd in 1975, there was a photographer, Chris Fuller, from the National Enquirer with them. His Kodak safety film proof was in that case file. The image is on the left. I enlarged the Chris Fuller image with those arrows. He's in that picture with all three of them, Moody, Lorenzen, and Fuller. Also, the back of the photo has a summary. It's up there. Staff Sergeant Charles Moody discusses UFO sketch with National Enquirer reporter Chris Fuller, Center and UFO investigator Lorenzen. Copyright National Enquirer. Published May 11th, 1976, page 4. Some other untruths that I uncovered in the July APRO bulletin from Jim Lorenzen. He wrote that Moody wrote to them on September 29th, that he was suddenly ordered overseas on November 29th. He wrote to them again and said that it was moved up to October 29th. Now, this is just not true. The case files had those original letters from Moody, and none of them say he was suddenly ordered overseas. Actually, the September 29th letter said that Moody asked to move up his leave date to December 5th from the original December 25th report date. He wanted his kids to be settled in before Christmas at his next duty station. In a November 14th letter from Moody, he told Carl Lorenzen he sold his home in Alamogordo and he was taking leave in Alamogordo, Texas, with his wife's family. And then they were going to go to Georgia to meet with his family before going to Spain, his next duty base. On November 19th, that was the day of the 3-page letter when Moody remembered everything that had happened to him. But also in that letter, he said he leaves for Turkey for TDY for 30 days, and then he goes on to Spain. He said right then they were in Amarillo until November 23rd. Then they were going to go to Savannah, Georgia to see his family over Thanksgiving. The Lorenzens' other publications mentioned the Moody case, but in those publications, their books, they said he disappeared without a trace in November of 1975, and that's just not true. Now, we have a lot of information on this Alamogordo event due to excellent investigation by APRO's Jim and Carl Lorenzen. They lived in Alamogordo from 1954 to 1960, and they both worked at Holloman. I think their knowledge and familiarity of the area added to this investigation. Jim and Wendell Stevens flying to Alamogordo to look at this site so soon after it occurred, that is really great investigation. I just really am not clear why they waited to publish the story so long. I read those letters that are back and forth from the Lorenzens and the Moody's, and they're filled with a lot of personal stuff in them. The Moody's, they talk about their children, and the Lorenzens talk about their health issues. Jim even had a heart attack during this investigative process, and the Moody's were really concerned about him. Charles Moody even wanted to fly back to check on Carl to make sure she was okay. They were all very friendly and very respectful of each other. I don't know. Maybe this is why the Lorenzens changed the story to say he disappeared without a trace and all that. Maybe they did that to protect Moody's Air Force career. That could be the reason why. So, hey, what do you think of this one? Isn't it great to recognize the locations of the topics so closely that we did during this Moody investigation? I want to know if anyone has any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. In the center screen, you're going to see a QR code. It's just a questionnaire asking if you like today's program and just asking for suggestions. There's just a couple questions on it. It only comes to me. I'm just looking for some new ideas. And I want to know if you like the format and the way I presented everything. I just want everyone to know I appreciate your time, and I'm really grateful that you all came today to the meeting. I also wanted to bring to your attention, though, that there's another QR code for you. News Nation's Ross Coulthart did a hell of a YouTube podcast this week, and we can all relate to this broadcast because we're right in the middle of it. He speaks about the use of direct energy weapons system that they were used on Wismar to shoot down a UAP using a high pulse microwave. I've spoken about this before. Like many of us know that this type of weapon system was developed out here on the range, most likely at Rathskeller or maybe that North Oscura Peak location that's over in the Tully Range area. But since July of last year, they started to actively use these bursts of electromagnetic energy to shoot down objects in Wismar airspace. It uses that directly, it's directly related to the February 2026 El Paso airspace shutdown, and it could be related to the May 14th crash of the medical helicopter that killed 4 people on board. It could directly be related to the use of this weapon. Look, Coulthart's broadcast is only 34 minutes, but if you want to speed it up to the 15-minute mark, that's where he discusses the Wismar related events. And at the 21-minute mark, he confirms that there was a shooting down of an anomalous object at Wismar. We're all going to recognize everything and every place he talks about in this broadcast, and I'll talk about it further in the future, but I just wanted to bring this to everyone's attention since I know this is a subject we're all really interested in. Also wanted to let you know my next meeting is in Las Cruces at the Brannigan Library on September 5th at 11 a.m. I'm just going to be rerunning the abduction of Staff Sergeant Charles Moody at that meeting. Also, my buddy Rose up at Albuquerque's Cosmic Connections, she's supporting a fundraiser up there, the Bigfoot Bash. It's on Halloween, October 31st, and they're going to have some great speakers. Jesus Payan, Hoyt Varday, Brenda Harris, and the Paranormal Rangers will be on hand. They're asking for a $25 donation, and that's going to support the YMCA of Central New Mexico. It's at the Brewery Craft Republic. There's some cards on the table with QR codes on them. They'll take you to the ticket site. And I hope you can join us here next month on Saturday, September 19th at 11 a.m. I'll probably discuss more about that Wismar shoot down because it's really a lot of it's in the news right now. But in September, I usually review the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, and I'm going to talk about the book from their niece, Kathleen Marden. The book was What to Do When You Have Been Abducted. So I want to thank everybody for your time today. I appreciate you coming to the Mufon meeting here at Otero Arts, and I'll see you next month.